A long, long time ago, 1,500 years ago, in fact, in the far north of what is now called Europe, there was a kingdom known as Geatland. In those days, it was a harsh country, mountains, narrow valleys, great caves along the coast, infested by enormous serpents that ambushed and devoured unwary fishermen. Geatland also had vast forests, where loathsome beasts prowled by night, feeding on sleeping pigs and innocent animals. The ruler of Geatland was called Higelac, a great brawny, bearded bear of a man, and for many years he had ruled over his people with a stern but benevolent hand. His queen was named Hige. She was known as the Wise and Fair. He had many warriors, their courage tested in many battles. They were tall and broad, each as strong as 10 men. They were yellow-haired, their eyes were deep-set and burned blue like the sea. In battle, these fighters were fierce and terrible, but in times of peace, they often dropped their warlike manner and sang and laughed and fondled their dogs and played with their children. One of these children was called Beowulf, and he was King Higelac's nephew. He was solitary and awkward when he was young. His movements were clumsy. He tripped over his sword. He broke whatever he touched. The other kids laughed at him for his clumsiness, but in secret they were astounded by his amazing strength and his extraordinary speed when he hunted. The years passed, and Beowulf grew to be a man. A big man. One night, a great feast was held in the king's drinking hall. From all over Geatland, famous warriors and chieftains gathered. Fires blazed at either end of the hall. Along the walls, flaming torches threw out flickering light on a corner piled with the weapons of the warriors. The spears tipped with bright metal, the massive swords glittering. The air was heavy with the smell of burning pine. Servants hurried from bench to bench with ox horns filled with heady mead, the favourite drink of the Norsemen. Large wooden bowls in bright colours and overflowing with meats stood on the tables. At one end, highest of all, Higelac and Hige, his queen, sat in their finery. They were served from dishes more beautiful and precious than the rest, and the queen paused often to acknowledge the toasts of her subjects with her gracious smile. At the feet of the royal couple sat Beowulf, at a table specially reserved for the most favoured of all the warriors of Geatland. But there were many murmurs of disapproval at young Beowulf in such a place of honour. "Who is this clumsy idiot, Beowulf? Why should he sit directly below our king?" Beowulf saw red, snatched up his knife, then slumped back. They're right, he thought. Yes, his strength was great, but there was no use for him to put it to. The country was at peace, and he longed for wild adventures and the chance to prove himself in battle. He lapsed into gloomy silence, eating little, but he drank long and deep, and like his draughts of mead, his thoughts too were deep and long. Then, at a signal from Higelac, the murmur of voices died down, until there was no sound in the giant hall save the spluttering of the flares on the walls and the snarling of 2 dogs over a chunk of meat on the earthen floor. "My brothers, there is among us tonight a man known only as the Wanderer. He says he brings a marvellous song for you to hear. It's been a long time since we had word from abroad. Sing to us, Wanderer. Tell us your news." The minstrel stepped from the shadows, a tall, rugged man, his beard streaked with grey, and his grey eyes were wide and fixed like one used to watching the far horizons. The Wanderer sat down, threw back his cloak, and with long, thin fingers struck the strings of his harp. He sang of the vast frozen north, of endless forests, of bleak mountains, of the grey sea, of the treacherous green-white icebergs. Then he sang of Hrothgar, king of Denmark across the sea, and how desolation had come to the king in the shape of a monster, part animal, part man, called Grendel. Some say it was a descendant of the tribes of Cain, cursed down the centuries, becoming more and more evil, twisted and foul, and Grendel was the last of his detestable line. But who knows? The wanderer continued. On one cruel night, the chieftains of Denmark were sleeping soundly in the great mead hall of Heorot, and Grendel had silently forced open the solid doors of the hall and slaughtered 30 of the greatest warriors of the Danes. Then for 12 long years Grendel had raided the king's hall again and again and brought death and destruction. In that time the brave young warriors of the king had not survived the nightly attacks, and Denmark had become a country of old men and defenceless women. And the wanderer sang of the grief of the wives and mothers and sisters of the slain warriors. He told of Unferth, Hrothgar's right-hand man, and how Unferth had not once offered to fight Grendel, because the fear in his heart was greater than his love for his king. At this a scornful murmur ran through the listeners, and the men of Geatland condemned Unferth as a black coward. Beowulf sat bewitched. Those around him failed to notice his heavy breathing and the light that had sprung into his blue eyes. The thoughts that ran through his head were confused, but one idea held clear above all the others. He would seek out this Grendel and kill him. Yes, kill him with his bare hands, these very hands. He saw himself face to face with the monster, and with a wild cry he leapt from his seat. "Lords of Geatland, this Hrothgar was a war brother of my father Ecgtheow. Therefore I claim kinship to him, and I will go to the land of the Danes. I will destroy this Grendel for him." Nobody moved. Then great shouting and confusion broke out. Fists banged on tables. Dogs barked dementedly. "Silence!" commanded Hygelac. "It seems the time has come, O Beowulf, for you to prove yourself. The gods have given you the strength of 30 men, and yes, you should use this strength to help our neighbour Hrothgar. Go to the land of the Danes. Go and fight this hated Grendel for the glory of Geatland. But I warn you, Beowulf, son of Ecgtheow, if you should fail, don't come back. Again I say, you have great strength. Use it well." A roar of approval went up from the crowd, for here was a Beowulf they had never seen before, and they greeted him for the first time as one of themselves, and not as a sullen boy whose strength had been so great that he had been made to seem a fool for it. Hygd the Queen glided through the turmoil and offered Beowulf a golden jewelled cup, and smiled at him in affection and pride. Then Beowulf drank from the jewelled goblet of Hygd, called the Wise and Fair, and he bowed before his uncle Hygelac and received the king's blessing. For 7 days and 7 nights the halls bustled with preparations, for Hygelac had ordered Beowulf to choose 14 warriors to accompany him and arm them with the finest weapons and armour in the kingdom. So, with the best grace he could muster, for Beowulf was stubborn, he did as he was told. At last they were ready, and torches flaming in the greyness before dawn, they gathered at the shore. There, ghostly in the half-light, hung their ship, its dragon prow rising and falling with the gentle waves. Hygelac and Hygd, the queen, inspected the warriors, the finest company of young men in all the north. Each stood well over 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders and sturdy legs, and each was as quick as a deer. But Beowulf outmatched them all in stature and speed, and Hygge thought, "This is indeed a fine young man," and his father and mother would have been proud to look upon him. At the king's signal, Beowulf called the men to hurry aboard. The vessel was loosed from her moorings, her painted oars dipped into the water, her sails billowed with a sharp wind, and she cut through the surf and out to the open surging sea. Hour after hour the sturdy ship fought the squalls and the waves that crashed and thundered against her sides. Beowulf and his men saw all kinds of strange creatures on that voyage. Playful fishes with scales as blue as the sky and bright small eyes, and long sea serpents which followed the ship for hours, turning and rolling in the sea. And so they came to the wild coast of Denmark, but the crashing breakers boiled white between them and the treacherous cliffs. Then, by a miracle, they found a tiny narrow inlet, and their sails tattered by the wind, they entered and saw a thin strip of beach at the edge of a deep forest, hung with grey fog and silent as death. The keel struck sand and carved a 40-foot gouge towards the boulders on the shore, and then, quick as wolves, but mechanical, terrible, the Geats leapt down, and with stiff, ice-crusted ropes they moved their craft. The chainmail rattled as they worked, silent, never speaking, lashing the helm bar, lowering the sail, unloading ash spears and battle axes. From the forest, a fur-bundled rider came galloping across the shingle, his horse's hooves shooting sparks. The rider stopped before the silent warriors. He was an old man, heavy with years, but fearless of eye, and with a mighty hand he shook his long barbed spear, the way attackers do when they're telling a man what they're going to do with his testicles. He asked, "Who are you, strangers in Denmark, that you dare to land so boldly here? Where are you from? What do you want? Who is your king? What is your lineage? Speak!" He scolded and fumed and blustered, and at last his voice gave out, and he sat coughing into his fist. Beowulf listened with folded arms. Finally he walked forward. "I am Beowulf, and I come from my uncle Hygge, king of the Geats. We've come as friends for a visit with your own king, Hrothgar." "Ah, yes," replied the guardian of the beach. "I know of Hygge. His fame is long spread to these parts. Tell me, Beowulf, why have you come here? You must know that Denmark has been a dead country these last 12 years, and Hrothgar, our king, is bowed with despair." "I know that well, guardian of the beach. We've heard that some kind of enemy stalks your hall at night. Kills men, so they say, and for some reason your warriors' weapons are useless. If that's so, we might be able to help." The guardian blinked. He looked at Beowulf's huge muscled shoulders, sleek as the belly of a shark, and rippling with the power of a bull. He looked at his men, the glinting armour, the bristling weapons, and guessed pretty much what sort of help he meant. "I welcome you then, O Beowulf, to these sad shores. Our king will certainly welcome you too. Leave your ship in my care. No harm will come to it." So the old man took them a little way into the forest and led them to a stone-paved path and wished them farewell. The snow lay deep over dense undergrowth and dank bog. There were no footprints. Clearly, it was a long time since this path to the sea had been used. They crested a ridge, and there was the vast hall of Heorot, the greatest mead hall in all the north. Around it were clustered the ruined homes and farms of Hrothgar and his people. Beowulf knocked on the mighty door. After a while, the king's herald nervously creaked it open and asked, who are you, strangers? What are you doing here? Beowulf said, Just tell your master that warriors from Geatland have arrived. The man stared at him anxiously for a moment, then hurried away with many a backward glance of fear at the 15 shining warriors. While they waited, the men from Geatland peered into the dismal hall. Its once gleaming pillars were now covered in cobwebs. The benches were thick with dust and moss. The walls were bare. The fires were cold. A faint scent of blood and decay hung in the air. Evil dark stains blotted the bare earth floor. It had become a place of silence and death, instead of feasts and rejoicing. Then came footsteps and the clanking of armour. First, a company of elderly warriors arrived, for Grendel had killed and eaten all the young ones. Then King Hrothgar himself appeared. He was an old man, with flowing white beard, and eyes that told their own story of sleepless nights and anguished days. The king marched forward with firm steps towards the Geats.
I bid you welcome, O strangers, but my trusty herald here tells me that you would say nothing of yourself or your business. Speak, my friends, for it is not proper that the king should remain in ignorance.
Beowulf answered, I am Beowulf, son of Ecgtheow and nephew to Hygelac, king of Geatland. These men have joined me in coming to the land of the Danes. We would like to rid you of this foul Grendel.
Beowulf! Why, your father Ecgtheow and I were brothers in arms many years ago. I knew you as a child, Beowulf, when you played around the hearth, pulling the ears of his dogs so that they cried out in pain and astonishment that one so young could be so strong. Welcome, Beowulf, welcome to Heorot. But I have to warn you, Grendel comes to Heorot at night, and it is in Heorot that you will meet the demon. But come, let your men remove their armour and rest. There'll be much feasting here tonight.
That night, for the first time in 12 years, there was a great banquet in the hall of Heorot. The walls were decorated with fine hangings. The golden roof gleamed and shone like the sun, and the benches were scraped and polished. Enormous fires were built, and the smell of roasting meats filled the hall. The inevitable drinking songs started.
Drink, 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 and many drinks were drunk to Beowulf and his men, and many cups were raised to the destruction of Grendel.
The mood, however, was tense. The Danes were not pleased, to say the least, that the Geats had come to save them. Honour was a big thing with them. They did not like the thought of being bailed out by strangers. In the king's high place sat Hrothgar, a golden crown upon his white locks. Beside him was his queen, Wilchtheow the Beautiful, in snowy white robes embroidered with silver, a silver band on her fair brow, silver bracelets on her slim wrists. Her hair was the colour of bright copper, and she wore it in 2 shining braids. Beowulf sat below the royal couple, in the place of honour. To his right sat Ashkada, the trusted counsellor of Hrothgar. On Beowulf's left was Unferth, the king's top man, the same Unferth the Wanderer had sung of. He was lean and black of hair, with a black divided beard, and he was dressed from head to foot in black and silver. Ashkada leaned towards Beowulf and engaged him in lively conversation. But Unferth sat moodily, scarcely touching the meats before him, and steadily swigging his mead. The warriors of Geatland praised everything about them, especially the magnificent hall of Heorot. But as the Danes and Geats sang and toasted, Unferth the Black lapsed more and more into sullen silence, and never once praised Beowulf, or lifted his beaker to him. Finally, Unferth leaned over and pointed the dagger he'd been eating with.
"Oi, friend," he sneered, "are you the same Beowulf who went swimming that time with young Breca, risked your lives in the middle of winter, for nothing, for a crazy mead boast?"
Beowulf stopped eating, smiled.
"We heard about that. Nobody could stop you. Nobody. Splash, splash, splash."
The Danes around him laughed.
"7 nights you swam, so people say."
The Danes laughed again. Even Hrothgar smiled.
"And at last, Breca beat you, much stronger than you were. He proved his boast, for whatever that's worth."
Now only Beowulf went on smiling. He and the huge Geats sat, patient as timber wolves.
"I predict it will go even worse for you tonight. You may have had victories. I don't know. I haven't heard. But wait up for Grendel, and he'll drown even the memory of you in your own blood."
And Unferth folded his hairy arms over his silver breastplate and glared at Beowulf in rage and hatred. Remember, Unferth had never offered to fight Grendel, and he was furious with all those who had done so in his place. Beowulf rose, still smiling, and towered over Unferth. "Ah, friend Unferth, drunk with mead, I see. You've said a great deal about Breca. Yes, he and I swam a great race, but the truth is that I beat him. I'm stronger in the ocean than any man alive. Yes, we plunged into the sea, Breca and I, in full armour, with swords in our hands to fight off whales." Unferth laughed. The others followed. "We swam for 5 days and nights, but Breca couldn't get away from me. Then a storm blew up, howling north winds, crashing waves, and we got separated. The storm stirred up the sea monsters. One of them tried to kill me, drag me down to the bottom where the sea would have crushed any other man. But I killed him instead, with my sword. Then the others attacked, hard. I killed them too, 9 of the beasts. And in the morning they lay on the shore, their bellies sword ripped. Towing poor Breca behind me, I swam to a headland, and we made our way home." Now the Danes had stopped laughing and stared at Beowulf in utter disbelief. He continued, "I don't boast much, Unferth, but Breca never fought such a battle, and neither have you. Come to think of it, I don't recall hearing of any glorious deeds of yours, except, some say, that you murdered your brothers. Is that right?" Unferth winced. "If that were the case, you'll crawl through the caverns of hell for that, friend Unferth." Hrothgar the king stood and said, "We've all heard the calm words of Beowulf, and they are the words of a hero. Beowulf will, I'm sure, forgive us if one of us has spoken unwisely, for there's been sorrow here these last 12 years, and sorrow long continued can make the tongue bitter with spite that we do not truly feel. But this is no time for foolish quarrels, and I urge you all to be grateful to these fine young warriors who have come to us in our time of need." Hrothgar raised his jewelled cup and drank. Then Wealhtheow took it and went down from the king's high table to Beowulf. He took the cup from her and drank deep from its golden depths. More toasting and feasting followed. Then the king rose and said, "It is time now that we hasten to our beds. Come, my friends, let Beowulf and his men rest." Then summoning Ashura and Unferth to his side, and with his hand upon his queen's lovely wrist, Hrothgar departed the hall and left Beowulf and his companions to whatever might come in the night. Beowulf and his men began locking the door of the hall. They secured it with wooden bolts and tied it with thick leather thongs, and it was so strong that no human could have opened it. Then the warriors unfolded their cloaks on the benches and lay down, and Beowulf stretched his great length on the dais of the king, determined that through the long night he would never once close his eyes. Near the door lay young Honshio, who swore that if anyone tried to enter, he would be the first to challenge him. The fires burned low. Silence crept over the shrouded forms as they lay on the floor and benches. The only sound was their steady breathing. Outside, a fog was creeping up from the sea. A strange kind of drowsiness came over Beowulf. His eyelids fluttered, and sleep started to lie on him like a heavy blanket, and the fog swirled around the vast mead hall in murky veils of damp gloom. The moon faded in the fog's depth, and the trees drip, drip, dripped. But suddenly there was a rustling among the wet trees, and a noise like the deep grunt of a pig, and a shadow loomed gigantic in all that was left of the moonlight. Inside, Beowulf and the Geats slept soundly, unaware of what was beyond the door, for the monstrous shadow was Grendel, and standing there in the fog-filled night, he placed a spell to make those who already slept sleep more soundly. But Beowulf was not quite overpowered, and hung in that space between sleeping and waking. This Grendel did not know, as he pressed his great shoulder to the door of Heorot, while Beowulf tossed and turned in the spell that possessed him. Little by little, the thongs that held the door gave way, and the heavy wooden bolts slowly yielded under the pressure, until, with a whoosh, the door flew wide, and Grendel stood there looming against the dark night, the fog weaving around him in white strands. Through the spell, Beowulf was slowly able to make out his shape. Now he saw the great form of Grendel swoop down upon innocent young Honshio, grab him in enormous hands and tear him limb from sleeping limb. And at last Beowulf saw what sort of thing this Grendel was. His legs were as thick as tree trunks. His hunched body was like neither beast or man, yet had something of the features of both. His skin was covered in a sort of grey, dry scale that made a sound like paper as he moved. Shaggy matted hair hung over the low forehead, and the eyes and the face of Grendel were the colour of milk, and the great jaw was filled with blunt fangs that ground the bones of poor Honshio to pulp. Hot, slippery blood covered the monster's face and hands. And when Grendel had finished his ghastly meal, the beast straightened his hulking form a little, and looked now to the left, now to the right, until his gaze fell upon the length of Beowulf. Then the milk-white eyes burned with a dull light, like the light of the moon, and slowly, slowly, Grendel moved toward the dais. But Beowulf, in a daze, staggered to his feet, grabbed the bench he had been sleeping on, and cracked it over Grendel's skull. Grendel stumbled back, baffled. Then he snarled and launched himself straight at Beowulf. As they brawled among the sleeping Geats, not one moved in the deep magic of their slumber. Beowulf felt the hot stink of Grendel's breath on his cheek, and sweat ran down into his eyes, and Grendel's long claws tried over and over again to crush his opponent's head. Then Beowulf slipped, but as he fell, his arms shot out, his fingers locked on Grendel's matted hair, and they both crashed together on the earth floor of Heorot, making the whole building tremble. Now Beowulf's terrible hand clamped like a dragon's jaw round Grendel's wrist, and they scrambled to their feet, locked in a grotesque handshake. Beowulf's crushing fingers tightened. A bolt of pain shot through the monster. His whole arm was on fire, and for the first time he started to feel afraid. He now only struggled to free himself, to take off into the night, away from this weird human whose strength was the strength of 30 men. He jumped back, yanked Beowulf off his feet and slammed him onto a table. Timbers cracked and splintered, but the deathly grip never wavered. Beowulf rose, smiled, and with one mighty heave he smashed Grendel face first into the wall behind him. Blood splattered, teeth shattered, and the great shaggy forehead split open. And now the Geat fastened both mighty hands on the monster's arm, and with a sudden twist that made Grendel gasp in agony, forced the imprisoned limb high up behind Grendel's back, and the beast crashed to the floor. Beowulf clung to the monster's arms. His foot found Grendel's neck, and slowly, he felt its great muscles and sinews start to tear, and he prayed to the gods for strength. And the mighty arm of Grendel ripped off in the terrible hands of Beowulf, and with a piercing shriek that shook the gilded rafters, Grendel thrashed in agony on the ground. At that moment, the spell that lay on the sleeping warriors was broken, and they struggled, as Beowulf had struggled, out of their nightmare sleep. Beowulf fell back, the bloody arm of Grendel in his hands, and Grendel, with a prolonged and ghastly wail, his blunt fangs gnashing in fury, stumbled towards the door, and before anyone could move, the wounded beast was away into the fog, which swallowed him as surely and completely as though he had plunged into the everlasting sea. And Beowulf, his dazed warriors crowding and babbling behind him in the doorway of Heorot, looked out into the fog-wet night, and the only sound that came to their ears was a steady drip, drip, drip of the mist from the black trees. Dawn crept clear and tranquil across the landscape, and touched the gold-bright hall of Heorot. Nervously, the people crept out, in twos and threes at first. Then in a great rush, and they crowded in fear and amazement at the great door of the mead hall, for high towards the rafters of Heorot the brawny men of Geatland were hoisting the mangled arm and torn shoulder of Grendel, the largest and most terrible arm in all the world, the torn sinews hanging dead, the red ooze of the beast's blood clotted and caked on the cruel curved fingers with their hooked talons. On the dais of the king stood Beowulf, his yellow hair like a golden cloud, and his sea-blue eyes flashing with the pride of a conqueror. Then a shout went up from 100 throats as the arm swung high from the roof. At this, the king and queen burst into the hall and rushed to Beowulf. Hrothgar spoke. "Beowulf, son of Ecgtheow, hail! This is the end of Grendel. Thank the gods for your coming. You have freed Denmark from the curse that has lain on us for 12 long years. Again and yet again. Hail to you, Beowulf, great hero of Geatland." Then the lady Wealhtheow the Beautiful praised him also, and called her servants to prepare a great feast. And the feasting and drinking lasted all that day and well into the night. But elsewhere in the night, deep under the earth, something was stirring. Something angry. Very angry. And little did they know of what was coming towards them through the darkness. Next morning, Hrothgar and Wealhtheow
were woken by a terrified messenger, his face twisted in panic. "What is it?" ordered the Queen. "What's wrong? You have fear written black in your eyes. Speak!" "My lady, terrible news! Your friend Ashkara lies dead at the threshold of Heorot, his head torn off, his limbs crushed to pulp. Hurry! Hurry!" Hrothgar and his queen dashed to Heorot at once, confused. Beowulf and his men followed, knowing nothing. They all stared in shock. The headless body of Ashkara lay mangled before them, and Grendel's arm was missing from the rafters. Wealhtheow turned to Beowulf. "Only one creature could have done this." "What? Another monster?" "We never told you. Grendel had a mother. She must still be alive."
"And is there a sister too? A brother? Uncles? Cousins? How many monsters must I kill?"
"No, there's only the Nightmare Mother, the last of her kind."
"Oh yes, she will be the last. Lady, we will wipe this new monster from the face of the earth." Then to the shaken king he said, "But we need horses, now, before the trail goes cold." As the servants scrambled off to the stables, Black Unfer stepped forward. In his hands was the mighty shaft of his black sword.
"Beowulf, I am ashamed that I doubted you. Please, take my sword Hrunting, for it will help you in this new ordeal. Please, let us bury our quarrel, and I will follow you to the very edge of the world."
Tears welled in his eyes, and Beowulf hugged Unferth like a brother. Then, holding high the dark sword Hrunting, and with King Hrothgar at his side, they all marched through the great doorway of Heorot, down the long flight of shallow steps, and mounted the fine, swift horses waiting for them in the streaming sunshine. Swiftly, swiftly they rode, Beowulf on a great white charger, and the king beside him on a horse as black as midnight, and behind them galloped the Danes and the warriors of Geatland, their armour gleaming in the sun. Massive dogs pounded ahead, having quickly picked up the powerful stink of Grendel's monster mother. On, over moor and fenland, until, at sunset, they came across a tall wooden stake, and at the top of the stake was the mangled head of Ashkara. Beyond it was a mere, skulking deep in a wood of tangled, burnt-out trees. The lake was small, but evil vapours rose from its surface, and the water moved as though giant things swam just below, waiting. The tracks led straight into the water, and the great hounds found no further scent, and sat at the edge, panting. The darkness thickened, and while the warriors lined the shores of the lake, looking for they knew not what, Beowulf buckled the black sword to his belt. "I'm going in," he said, "after this monster woman." A murmur of protest went up. Several men stepped forward. "Yes, but I go alone. I go alone. Wait here for me. I'll be back. That's a promise." Then, fully armed, he ran straight into the lake, a shout on his lips, his fair hair streaming like light, and the leaden waters closed thickly over him, and the lake's surface shuddered, and Beowulf disappeared from sight. Down, down, down he sank. At first, he could see nothing. He felt things brushing against his body, soft, slimy things that slipped and glided. He swung the sword Hrunting, but couldn't tell if he hit anything. Gradually, as he sank, the darkness lessened. The water was now glowing softly. Immense sea animals and fish swayed past him in the mysterious light, and each threw him an evil glance from its glowing eyes of red or green or sapphire blue. The scales glinted like beaten gold, and his sword glanced uselessly from their sides. Down, down, down he sank, through that shimmering and silent world. Far below, he saw a reddish glow, like from a bonfire. He looked back up through the gloom, but as he looked, something grabbed him round the waist, and before he could react, he found himself dragged into an underwater cavern, brilliantly lit by a great fire. And gripping him was the most loathsome hag he had ever seen. He knew at once she was Grendel's mother. Same matted hair, same blunt fangs, the powerful lean body, yet strangely female, almost human. She was once very tall, Beowulf saw, but now so bent that he looked down into her eyes, and her eyes glared straight back at him, filled with terrible pain and grief and hatred. She knew who Beowulf was too. Her jaws snapped open, and with a howl of anguish and fury, the mother's great claw fingers sank into his flesh, and they struggled there at the bottom of the world, in a cave under the water, and Beowulf felt a fear like nothing he had ever known. His legs melted under him like wax. There was a spell on him that drained him of all strength. He managed to draw his sword, Hrunting, but slash as he would, Hrunting would not pierce her skin, and at last clattered to the floor from his numb hand. She twisted this way and that, and with each twist the horrible hands reached nearer and nearer to his throat, and he grew weaker and weaker, and his breath came shorter and faster. He managed to lock his leg round one of the monsters, and then, with all his strength, he seized the hag and threw her. But in falling, she fell upon him, and now the grinning jaws were close above his face, and her sharp claws found his throat. But for a moment, the smallest moment in the world, she relaxed her hold. So sure was she of her victim, and in that tiny moment the magic lifted, and Beowulf, with a loud yell, hurled her from him. He staggered to the wall of the cave and found, suddenly, in his grasp, the hilt of an ancient giant sword, driven deep into the rock. Beowulf clutched it with both hands and heaved with the last of his fading strength. He glanced behind. She was coming for him, claws and jaws slowly opening. Then, in one mighty movement, he wrenched the blade from the wall, swung high, and so great was the force of the blow he struck Grendel's mother that he cut her clean in half from skull to crotch. Brains, blood, lungs, and guts splattered at Beowulf's feet. Then all the spells dropped from him, and he stood panting above the dead monster. The fire, out of control, had leapt high to the roof of the cave. Against the glare, Beowulf saw the massive corpse of Grendel in a far corner. Quickly, Beowulf cut off Grendel's head and then threw the two bodies on the flames. Holding the head of Grendel in one hand and in the other the magic sword, Beowulf ran to the entrance of the cave, dived in, and surged up through the black night of the water. And in his hands, the blade of the magic sword melted away, dissolved by the poisoned blood of Grendel and his mother, until only the carved hilt remained in his grasp. Up, up, up he swam, and all around him the dark waters were red from the blood of his victims. Hrothgar and his men had stayed for a long time, but at last, giving up all hope of ever seeing Beowulf again, they had turned slowly for home. Only the 13 Geat warriors remained on the shore waiting. Then one of them, who had been watching the lake closely, cried out, "Look! In the water! Blood!" And the reddened waters bulged and heaved, and Beowulf broke the surface with a tremendous shout. They crowded round him, demanding to hear what had happened, but he would tell them nothing, just that he had killed the monster mother, and they showed them the hilt of the magic sword and the gory head of Grendel. The rest of the story he would tell in front of Hrothgar. And so they mounted their horses, and singing the battle songs of warriors, they galloped towards the hall of Heorot. You can imagine the joy at their arrival. The feasting and drinking went on far into the night, with many speeches praising the courage and strength of Beowulf, and the loudest praise of all came from the lips of black Unferth, and all the warriors cheered at his shining words. Dawn broke at last, and Beowulf announced that now his mission was over, and that he and his men must leave for home. Then Hrothgar the king rose and said, "Beowulf, my adopted son, you have accomplished great things for me and my countrymen. We thank the gods for sending you, and we must reward you and your men properly for what you have done." It was not a good idea, in those days, to appear stingy with the old rewards. Somebody dangerous could see it as an insult, and might feel obliged to pick a fight. So he signalled to his servants, and they brought rich presents for the men of Geatland: armour, fine swords, carved drinking horns, chests of gold and silver and jewels. Later that morning, a great crowd gathered on the shore to see the warriors embark, and none of them was happier than the ancient guardian of the beach who had watched over their boat. As the sails filled with fresh wind, joyful shouts from the shore thundered out with gratitude. Banners fluttered in the morning breeze, and Beowulf's ship turned toward distant Geatland. And so ended Beowulf's adventures among the Danes. We know he returned home safely, and was hailed as the greatest of all the heroes in the north. After a time, death came to his uncle Hygelac during a momentous battle with the Frisians and the Franks, and Beowulf became king of Geatland. 50 years passed, and as Beowulf grew old, so he grew in dignity and strength. His fame spread across the wide seas, and his many enemies trembled at his name and thought twice about going to war with him. But all this time, nothing equal to the slaying of Grendel and his monster mother came to test him, and the king grew restless for a last great adventure, for he knew he had not many years left on earth. One deep winter night, as the king sat in his mead hall with all his warriors around them, there was a knocking at the door. When the servants opened it, in came the shabbiest visitor that had ever crossed that threshold. The servants would have thrown the stranger out again, had not Beowulf, Beowulf's second in command, called out, "Let him stay," for there was something in the man's face that caught his interest. "Who are you?" demanded Beowulf. "Where have you come from? Speak! Look, don't be scared. No one will harm you. Come and eat, and later you will tell your story to the king." But the stranger shook his head, and so Beowulf led him a little roughly before Beowulf. "This fellow here, he won't say what his name is, or where he comes from, but he will speak to you, Lord Beowulf. I know." Then Beowulf gazed at him kindly, and urged the visitor to have no fear. The man knelt and spoke. "Great king, I have no name. I am just a poor slave. I escaped from a Frankish galley, and I've been trying to find my way home to the north. Early this morning, faint from cold and hunger, I came across an enormous barrow." Barrows, by the way, are long earth mounds covering stone burial chambers. The stranger continued. "I crept inside. There, sleeping, was the most colossal dragon, surely, in all the wide world. I fled in panic, but after a while, when I recovered, I was taken with a burning curiosity, and I crept back, and there I saw, heaped all round the sleeping dragon, the greatest treasure that any man ever saw in one place." Beowulf leaned forward in his great chair. "Slave, if you're lying, I will first have you beaten like a dog, and then torn limb from limb." But the stranger did not flinch. Instead, he drew from beneath his tattered cloak a glittering jewelled chalice, standing on a base of purest carved gold.
"See," he said simply, "I do not lie."
Beowulf handled it in wonder and held it to the firelight. But at this point, the exhausted stranger blacked out. Beowulf caught him and called to the servants, "Take this poor wretch away. Give him food and drink. Then let him rest." Beowulf the king sat deep in thought for a while, then stood and said, "My friends, this slave has shown us this incredible cup of gold and jewels. He says that where this came from, there is more and still more treasure. But he may have put us all in terrible danger. When this dragon wakes up and finds he has been robbed, he is going to go berserk. I want 11 men who will follow me to the lizard's lair and kill him while he's still sleeping. This menace must be destroyed." Faithful Beowulf stepped forward, but as he opened his lips, the night was shattered by a roar that shook the roof of the hall and made the earth tremble. And at the entrance door, blue flames began to lick along the sill. Beowulf shouted, "Men, get your weapons! Save the women! Run!" And they all fled through a back way, leaving the great hall empty, the benches overturned, the rafters already starting to burn. An angry red dawn broke over the ashes of the mead hall. Farms and houses burned, and a deep rumbling across the sky told of the relentless revenge of the dragon. Concealed in the depths of a great forest, Beowulf and his band of 11 trusted warriors held a council of war. Some thought they should attempt to ambush the dragon while it was demented and wreaking destruction. Others were in favour of waiting until he became exhausted and was fair game for their sharp swords. Beowulf held up his hand. "Listen, neither of these plans will work. First, if we attack the dragon while he's still rampaging across the land, the creature will be able to escape in any direction. Nor can we simply stand idly by while he runs amok and continues to destroy our kingdom. No, we must stick to my plan, find his lair and destroy him there. For when he finds that we have gone to his barrow, he will leave our halls and farms alone and try to defend his precious treasure. We must go right now, for soon enough he will know what we're up to." And Beowulf was right, for even as he spoke, the dragon knew by magic of their plans, and snapping his gigantic jaws in rage, the beast rushed to protect what it had guarded for over 300 years. Night was coming down when at last Beowulf and his 11 men approached the dragon's barrow. It lay in a clearing among the dark forest, and the only light was the reflection of the dead day on the snowy ground. At the entrance to the barrow, the red steam of the dragon's hot breath hissed out. All round the snow was trampled flat, and the trees were blackened and scorched. Then Beowulf said to his men, "I go alone to attack this dragon. You stay right here and be ready in case I fail. For I am an old man now, and I see, as in a dream, that this will be my final fight." Then, gripping his mighty iron shield in his left hand, and in his right his massive sword, Beowulf advanced. But all his trusted men, except for faithful Beowulf, were gripped by a sudden panic and ran off into the dark shelter of the forest. King Beowulf did not notice them run. His eyes were on the mouth of the barrow, and his ears were filled by the dragon's breathing and the swish, swish of the angry body inside the cave. Then Beowulf cried out, "Monster! I am Beowulf,
King of Geatland, Prince of Weders, and son of great Edgetheo, and I challenge you to battle. Come out! Pit your strength against my strength, the greatest strength in all the north.
For a moment, no sound came from the cave, and no steamy breath, and no dull glare of fire. Then, with a sudden roar that caused the night to splinter and the earth to quiver, the most magnificent dragon in all the world rushed from its lair. Over 50 ells in length it measured, from the proud head to the poisoned tail tip, and its glittering body was covered with brass scales, 3 fingers thick. Its feet had 6-inch razor-sharp claws. Its eyes were of green fire. Its wide nostrils belched red flame and steam, and the immense jaws dripped livid ooze. Beowulf snatched up his shield just in time, or he would have been incinerated on the spot. Again came a moment's pause, while the two antagonists stood firm and eyed each other. The battle erupted like a crack of lightning. The night forest was filled with a cacophony of combat. Beowulf slashed out bravely, but his sword clashed uselessly against the dragon's scales, and he struggled to keep himself from being reduced to ashes. He ducked and stabbed this way and that until the dragon was so frustrated that his roaring grew louder and more terrible, and the violent swing of his huge body grew wider and wilder, and always Beowulf's sword looked for its vulnerable spot. Every dragon has one. Beowulf's breath came short and stifled. His arms weakened as he fought the living furnace. His legs shook beneath him, and the heavens seemed to close down upon him. Beowulf could stand by no longer, and charged forward, roaring. Beowulf heard his friends shout, and new strength streamed through his veins. Together they fought, side by side, and the dragon gave way to their onslaught. But in one wild swing of the dragon's tail, Beowulf was caught. He whirled high in the air, and his broken body fell to the ground. But Beowulf, with a great cry of rage, at last found the weak spot in the dragon's armour, and sank his sword to the hilt into the heart of the beast. No sound came from the dragon, but he rose up, up to his full and terrible height, swayed for a moment, and as if in slow motion, crashed down beside Beowulf. There came a shout from the men hiding in the forest, and they rushed towards their dying king, but Beowulf drove him away. "Get away, you treacherous scum! Not for you the honours of a fight you ran away from! Away, cowards! Our king lies dying, destroyed in a glorious battle to save you and your foul breed from the dragon's fury." Then turning to Beowulf, he knelt at his side and loosened his helmet. "Oh, my dear king, you can't die now. Not in your hour of victory." "No," answered Beowulf. "Not my victory, but yours, my faithful friend. Take the treasure. Do what you want with it. But let me have one piece of it about me as I die. For I die soon, my friend. Hurry, hurry." Then Beowulf went into the dragon's barrow and picked from the heaped-up gold and jewels a marvellous glittering crown and placed it on the brow of his king. "I die," whispered Beowulf, "and I forgive those men, those foolish men who deserted. Farewell, Beowulf, my own true friend. And now, time to sleep, the longest sleep." From far and near, the men and women of Geatland gathered to honour their dead king. They carried his body to Whale's Headland, where a great barrow was made for him, and beside it, above the darkling sea, they built a huge funeral pyre of hefty logs and pine branches. Then the massive dragon was dragged to the precipice, and when it fell into the grey sea, far, far, far below, a shout went up from 1,000 throats as it slipped below the lonely waves. 6 warriors brought Beowulf's body on his mighty shield. His great sword was laid upon his chest, and the jewelled crown from the cave on his brow. Darkness came, and the sound of the waves beneath Whale's headland grew more and more insistent, as though the sea, remembering Beowulf's early days, mourned his passing too. Now at last Beowulf was laid upon the pyre, and all around him were heaped the treasures from the dragon's mound. Then Beowulf approached with 2 flaming torches. He held the flares high above his head and plunged them into the pyre. The flames leaped up, staining the dark night crimson, and so great was the glare that the stars dimmed and the sea fell silent. Higher and higher rose the flames, and with them the sobbing of the people, and all night long they marched around the burning pyre, until at last there was nothing left but a high mound of grey ashes in the grey dawn. So he passed to the old gods, Beowulf, king of Geatland in the north.